Hi there. If you're here right now, thank you. Truly. There's something quietly beautiful about two strangers meeting in the stillness of a story. Maybe you're opening this video on a quiet evening, looking for something soft to fall asleep to. Maybe the day has been loud, and all you want is a voice that won't ask too much from you. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you made it here. This story won't shout, it won't rush, but it will sit with you in silence, in softness, in that quiet space between memory and dream, where pain doesn't need to be explained, only witnessed. So if this story finds you, even just a part of it, and if it resonates, even for a moment, stay. Listen as far as you feel like. And if you'd like, leave a small sign, a simple "I'm here" in the comments, or a like, a share with someone who needs it. And if you wish, subscribe so you won't miss the next quiet voice in the dark, because sometimes all we need is a gentle reminder that we are not alone. Now, let's begin. Slowly, as if we're telling each other stories under a dim light, in a small kitchen that still smells like tea and cold bread, while the snow outside keeps falling and the world, finally, hushes. Fanai. Nhung nam jiao trong kai lan chuang mot. Mui swang som va tach. Tra jen. The walls are sweating cold again. You wake up not because you want to, but because the cold has reached some inner part of you, the kind that sleep cannot protect. It's not a sudden waking, more like your body giving up on the idea of warmth. You lie still for a moment, eyes barely open, and watch your breath drift into the air like the ghost of your dreams. The window is fogged, rimmed with a thin frost despite the old towel stuffed into the frame. The glass crackles softly as it meets the dawn. Your blanket is too thin. It always has been. But somehow, you've stopped expecting it to change. You sit up slowly. There is no rush. Time here does not race. It waits in thick silence, like damp cloth hung too long on a line. You reach for your coat before getting out of bed. No one walks barefoot here, not even across the floor of their own home. The apartment is still dark, still quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but watchful. You know others are awake. You can feel them. The creak of the floor above. The slow tap of water from a pipe that no longer closes. A kettle being filled in the room next door. You strike a match. The flame sputters, almost giving up, but then steadies, flickering gold against peeling wallpaper. You light the stove. A weak blue flame hisses to life. You set the kettle on top, and then you wait. There's a chair by the small kitchen table. You sit, pull the coat tighter, glance at the empty seat across from you, as if someone might suddenly appear to fill it. They never do. But still, the ritual of pretending matters. The kettle begins to whisper, not a boil, not yet, but the prelude to something warmer. You reach for the chipped cup on the shelf. It's your only one. White, with a faded red stripe. Inside it, a paper-thin tea bag, used once, maybe twice before. You don't remember. It doesn't matter. You pour the water slowly. The steam rises, curls, fades, like breath, like hope. And then you hold it. That one warm thing. A tach tra jen. Too bitter, too weak, too precious. You wrap both hands around it and hold it close to your face, letting the warmth graze your lips before you even sip. It fogs your vision. It fogs your thoughts. For a moment, everything softens. Outside the window, the city is waking, but not with joy, not with color, just the sound of boots on concrete, the rattle of tram wires, a cough from the hallway. You sip. It tastes like boiled water and old leaves, and yet it is the best part of the day. Because here, in this quiet corner of a concrete hive, the world has not yet asked anything from you. Not yet. You are still allowed to sit, to be. to disappear into the steam. You hear a door slam down the hall, then another. Somewhere, a baby cries. Somewhere else, a man swears softly as he tries to force his key into a lock. Life is returning to the building, loud, tired, and gray. But here, in this moment, with your coat wrapped around your knees and your breath tracing shapes in the air, you are still alone, still invisible, still yours. And that is enough to keep going. The bucket is cold against your palm, even though it's been filled with warm water just minutes ago. The handle squeaks with every step as you carry it through the corridor. Not out of pain, but out of habit, like everything in this place. The white enamel is chipped at the rim. Everyone's bucket looks the same. But this one is yours. It knows your fingers, your grip, the rhythm of your walk. The hallway is barely lit. One of the bulbs flickers in protest above your head, casting your shadow in short, broken spasms across the peeling wall. You walk faster, not because you're late, but because here, in this narrow passage that connects too many lives, standing still feels like trespassing. The walls are too close. You brush against them without meaning to. You smell the mildew clinging to the plaster. Cigarette smoke from a door cracked open 2 units down. The faint trace of pickled cabbage. Everything here touches you, even when it doesn't. You try not to meet eyes. Someone passes you from the other side. A hunched figure wrapped in a long coat, and silence. You both flatten your backs to opposite walls, squeeze past like strangers avoiding confrontation in a dream. No hello. No nod. There is no room for greetings here, only survival. When you reach the door to the communal bathroom, you pause. You always do. You listen for sounds inside. Water dripping, a shuffle of feet, the clearing of a throat. Nothing. Still, you knock. 3 soft taps, a courtesy, a warning. Silence. You turn the knob. The door creaks open, revealing a room tiled in a dozen fading shades of beige and green. The light is yellow and unforgiving. A mirror leans forward from the wall as if ashamed of its own reflection. The air smells of soap and resignation. You place the bucket down beside the rusted drain. Its splash echoes, reminding you, again, that sound travels here too easily. That walls are too thin. That water, like memory, always finds a way to seep through. You begin to undress, slowly, carefully, not because you're delicate, but because speed feels wrong in this act. There's something sacred about trying to be clean in a place where nothing truly ever is. You wash with short motions, efficient, purposeful, not a ritual, not a pleasure, just a necessity carried out under the imagined pressure of time. Behind you, the door remains closed, but you can already feel it. Someone will knock. They always do. You rinse the cloth, squeeze it tight, feel the warmth slide off your arms. You count the seconds. 10, 12, 15, and then knock, knock, knock. You freeze, soap still on your shoulder. There it is. The sound that always comes. The reminder that this body, this moment, this room, none of it truly belongs to you. You clear your throat. 1 minute, you say. No reply. Just the creak of someone shifting weight outside. Just the ticking of pressure. You finish quickly. Too quickly. You leave damp patches on your back. You pull your shirt over skin that hasn't dried yet. You wring out the cloth. You gather the bucket. When you open the door, there's a woman waiting. Middle-aged. Hair tied with a faded ribbon. She doesn't look at you, and you don't look at her. She brushes past, holding her own bucket with fingers stiff from the cold. You walk back down the same corridor. This time, everything feels tighter, like the walls have moved closer in your absence. You're already late, but not really. Because here, being on time means blending into the line, moving with the herd, one gray coat after another. You can't be late when time is measured in sameness. You step into the street, and the cold greets you like an old habit, not with hostility, but with that quiet certainty that it will be with you all day. You adjust your scarf, pull your hat lower, and head toward the tram stop, boots crunching softly on old snow and fresh ash. The morning sky is the color of wet paper. You don't need to check your watch. You know the schedule by heart. It's not about minutes. It's about instinct. You've caught this tram so many times that your body moves on muscle memory. You could walk the whole path blindfolded and still stop at the right place on the platform, right beside the fourth column, under the broken light. The tram arrives with a sound that belongs to no other machine. A high metallic whine mixed with the rattle of 1,000 tired joints, like a creature that no longer wants to move but keeps going anyway, just like you. The doors open with a sigh. Warm air spills out, but not enough to matter. You step in. Inside, silence. Dozens of people, shoulder to shoulder. No one speaks. No one looks up. You slide into your spot by the window. Not because it's yours, but because no one else bothers to take it. The glass is frosted over. You can only see shadows of the city passing by. Chimneys, billboards, smoke. The tram lurches forward. You sway with it. Everyone does. Like clockwork. Every day begins this way. Same faces, same coats, same silence. Sometimes you wonder if you're riding through time, not space. If maybe the tram isn't taking you anywhere at all, just dragging you back and forth through the same morning, again and again, until the days blur and disappear. Your hands are in your lap, your gloves are thinning. You can feel the cold seeping through, numbing your fingers. You think about nothing. You try to. Because thinking makes the ride longer. Sometimes your mind goes rogue, wanders. It imagines color, music, a joke, a kiss. But then the tram jolts over a rail joint and the thought breaks, shatters. You're not here to dream, you're here to arrive. The tram slows as the factory comes into view, the massive concrete skeleton of Kirov, looming like some forgotten fortress. Smoke curls from chimneys. Windows reflect nothing but gray. And then, the gates. Tall, black, imposing, not decorative, functional. These are not the kind of gates you pass through. They swallow you. You step off the tram. The line moves forward. No talking, no hurrying, just motion. You pass through the gate like everyone else. You don't look up. You don't need to. You already know what it looks like. You've seen it in dreams, in the dark, on the backs of your eyelids. And as the gate closes behind you, with a low final clunk, the world outside ceases to exist. You don't remember when the sound stopped bothering you. Maybe it never did. Maybe you just stopped noticing. The way people stop noticing their own breathing. The way the body filters out its own background noise. The machine hums. It's not a hum, really. It's a low grind, rhythmic, metallic, almost cruel in its steadiness. A kind of purr if machines could purr in resentment. It shudders every few seconds, just slightly, as the blade touches steel. That's your cue to lift your hand, rotate, adjust, lower again. One piece, then another, then another, then another. Your hands are tough now, not in the romantic way, not like the hands of a sculptor or a carpenter, touched by honest craft. Your hands are calloused where they shouldn't be. Your knuckles crack not from age, but from cold. Your fingernails have tiny half-moons of grime that never go away. And yet, they move without you. Left, turn, lower, wait, release. The same sequence, repeated hundreds of times, thousands. Some days, you dream about the movement. You wake with your fingers twitching, as if your hands are still working even when you sleep. Someone once told you that machines were the future. You believed them. Back then. Now, You wonder if they meant that we would become the machines. The man next to you doesn't speak. You've seen him every day for years. You don't know his name. Or maybe you did once and forgot it somewhere between winter and spring. He smokes during breaks. His coat smells like oil. His face is blank. He moves, just like you. Left, turn, lower, wait, release. It's not coordination. It's absorption. You glance at the wall clock, not because you expect time to move, but because it's the only thing that does. The hands twitch forward every 60 seconds like a cruel joke. Still 8:42. Still morning. Still a long way to go. The supervisor walks past. He doesn't look at you, but you feel him anyway. His steps are too loud, too clean. He walks like he owns the rhythm but doesn't have to live inside it. You don't mind him exactly, but you hate the clipboard, the ticking pen, the illusion that something is being measured. You look back at the part you're working on, a cylinder of steel, identical to the one before it, and the one before that, and the hundreds yet to come. You don't know what they're for. You stopped asking. Not your job to know, just your job to shape, to carve, to make it fit. Fit into what? It doesn't matter. Left, turn, lower, wait, release. The lunch bell rings, but it doesn't feel like a break, just a brief suspension. You step away from the machine and for a moment, the silence feels deafening. You realize how loud everything has been and how quiet you've become. You eat quickly, bread, soup, a piece of sausage, warmth but no flavor, conversation but no meaning. Someone says something about politics, another shrugs. No one really argues anymore. Then back to work, back to hum, grind, shudder, back to becoming part of something that does not care if you're tired or sad or alive. And as the day drags on, as your arms ache and your eyes blur and your feet throb inside stiff boots, you wonder, what if you stopped? What if one day you just didn't lift your hand? Would anyone notice? Would the machine? Would the part? You don't know, because by then your hand has already moved. Left, turn, lower, wait, release. It came folded in four. A pale square of official paper, creased and stained at one edge, passed from one tired hand to another like a secret. You didn't expect it. Not really. Rumors had circled the corridors for months, maybe years. People whispered of lists, of quotas, of entire buildings being planned somewhere beyond the smoke. But you'd heard whispers before. They float easily in buildings with thin walls. You held the paper in both hands, like something fragile. The ink was typed, blue and formal, but your eyes clung to the line that mattered: allocation of new residents, building number. 12, Unit 3, Khrushchevka. Block. For a moment, your heart did something strange. It rose, not like a bird, but like steam, hesitant and warm. Then it fell again, just slightly. You read it again, and again, just to be sure it hadn't changed. You didn't smile. Not yet, because you knew better. Hope here was dangerous. It could swell in your chest like a balloon and burst with the simplest pin: a misfiled name, a policy change, a construction delay, or some quiet decision made by a man with cleaner boots than yours. But still, this wasn't nothing. You stood in the hallway outside your room, still hearing the drip of someone else's faucet behind your wall, the faint laughter from a neighbor's radio. You folded the paper again, slowly, neatly, like it might be tested for fingerprints, and you slid it into your coat, close to your ribs, as if warmth might make it more real. In the following days, you told no one, not even your sister, who shared the same bed. You didn't want to say it out loud. Speaking gave things shape, but also weight, and heavy things break more easily. So you kept it silent, like a tiny flame cupped in both hands against the wind. Still, it changed how you moved. You walked lighter. You looked out the window longer. You noticed things. The rust on the elevator buttons. The way the hallway light flickered when someone upstairs ran water. You'd always seen them. But now, you saw them as something temporary. Something you might soon leave behind. The idea was dizzying. That you might wake one day in a place with walls that didn't echo other people's arguments. That you might cook without waiting in line. That your toothbrush might live in a cup alone. But under the hope, under the quiet thrill, was something else. A worry you couldn't name. Because if they could give this to you, couldn't they also take it away? And if you allowed yourself to imagine a different life, and it didn't come, how would you return to this one? You watched the construction from afar, walking the long way home just to glimpse it. The Khrushchevka rose fast, bare and boxy, like a row of promises still waiting for doors. Men worked in silence. Concrete slabs stacked like gray bread. A crane creaked in the wind. There was no beauty in it. Not really. But to you it shimmered. Like possibility. The day they confirmed it, officially, with a second paper and a time and date, you didn't cry. You felt nothing for a long moment. Then, everything all at once. You touched the wall of your shared kitchen that night, your palm flat against the peeling paint. It was like saying goodbye to a cell that had once felt like home, like pressing your ear to a coffin you were climbing out of, not out of triumph, out of permission. You were being allowed to hope, and that, more than anything, frightened you. It took a few days before you dared to rearrange the shelves, not because it was difficult, but because it felt monumental. That tiny kitchen, no bigger than an elevator, had already begun to gather meaning. Every mug placed, every plate dried, every bag of flour tucked into the corner carried a small declaration. This is mine. And with each motion, you were quietly rewriting what it meant to exist, not as someone in a place, but someone of a place. You began folding the dish towel differently. You bought a wooden spoon, not out of need, but out of ceremony. You hung it on the wall next to the stove, even though it barely fit, and smiled every time you passed. There was something holy in that gesture. A wooden spoon wasn't just a tool, it was a flag, a quiet waving of independence. One morning, while sipping tea, you realized the light fell through the curtain in a way that painted delicate patterns on the floor. It was the same curtain you hung that first day. Slightly wrinkled, embroidered with clumsy blue daisies. But now it felt earned. Its fabric had absorbed your cooking smells, your evening thoughts, your solitude. It no longer looked like something new. It looked like it belonged. You let your hair down more often, not for anyone to see, not for beauty, but for freedom. In this space, you could move as you pleased. You could sing while cleaning. You could leave the bed unmade. You could burn the onions and swear at the stove. You could cry in the bath without rushing to hide the sound. There was no more performance, no more waiting for someone to knock, no more lowering your voice in case the neighbor pressed their ear to the wall. The silence now was sacred, not threatening. It didn't watch you. It held you. Your friends came over one evening, just two of them, sitting on mismatched chairs, knees almost touching in the cramped room. You poured tea in old chipped mugs and passed around dry biscuits. The kettle hissed like a lullaby in the background, and the radiator clicked softly beneath the window. They marveled at the space, not because it was grand, but because it was yours. One of them touched the curtain and said, "You even have this." You nodded, "Yes, and I chose it." And in that moment, you weren't just someone with a roof over your head. You were someone with taste, with choice, with voice. Outside, the city went on as usual, cold, gray, impersonal. But here, in this box of concrete and dreams, life unfolded differently. You placed flowers in an old glass jar and called it a vase. You taped postcards to the refrigerator and called it decoration. You kept your keys in a bowl by the door and called it home. Not because anyone told you to, but because you could. That was the miracle, wasn't it? Not the space itself, but the permission it gave you to be soft, to be specific, to be someone. And in a world where the collective always came first, this tiny apartment whispered something daring. You matter. The transition from light to shadow never made sense. You'd step out of the metro, all marble and chandeliers and bronze reliefs, a subterranean temple to progress, where every ceiling gleamed like a promise and every arch whispered of strength. The floor tiles reflected your footsteps like a polished memory. The lamps glowed with dignity, as if every passenger was a guest of the state. You felt it in the hush of arrival, a kind of orchestrated elegance, the illusion of forever. And then, 30 steps above, you'd walk into a shop that had nothing but pickled beets and air. The shelves stretched on like theater sets, empty, polished to show they weren't abandoned, just waiting for something that didn't come. You stood in line anyway. Lines were a reflex. No one ever explained what would arrive, or when, or if. You queued for hours with strangers, bonded by silent discipline and sore knees. You watched the old woman ahead of you shift her weight. You counted the cracks in the wall. You made up names for the two teenage girls whispering near the counter. And when your turn came, you leaned forward as if into confession. Do you have sugar? A pause. A sigh. A shake of the head. Only mustard. You nodded as if this was an acceptable outcome. You bought the mustard. You didn't need mustard. You just needed something. Leaving the shop, paper bag rustling in your hand, you sometimes passed a mirror, maybe in the glass of another storefront or the side of a bus stop, and for a second you'd see your own face and feel the split. The one who stood in a metro hall fit for kings, and the one who walked out clutching a jar of vinegar. You couldn't reconcile them. One half of you belonged to the poster world, the world of rockets, victories, medals, and slogans. The other lived on cabbage soup and silent afternoons. The contradiction was never spoken, but it was lived every day. You learned to perform it. When guests came from abroad, rare as they were, you took them to the metro. You pointed at mosaics. You quoted numbers. The number of passengers per day, the year it opened, the marble imported from Georgia. You spoke with pride, and the pride wasn't false. You were proud, just not full. The shops remained quiet, the displays unchanged. You learned to lower your expectations gently, like putting a cracked bowl back on the shelf. You adjusted recipes. You reused. You borrowed. You smiled with your lips more than your eyes. And still, each morning, you descended into that palace below ground. Sometimes you looked up at the chandeliers and wondered how many people had ever truly stared at them. Really stared. How many saw beauty, not just utility. How many stood still long enough to marvel, not just rush. You did. You let your gaze rest on the painted ceilings. You counted the lamps. You stepped a little slower on the mosaic floors, even if others bumped past you, because there, in that fleeting journey between stations, you felt something you couldn't name, a brush with greatness, a shadow of something larger, and then the surface again, gray sky, wind against your neck, the weight of a plastic bag in your hand, the echo of a shopkeeper's shrug still lingering in your ears. This was your reality, a world of shining ceilings and empty shelves, a life caught between monuments and mustard. And somehow you learned to carry both. There were nights when the apartment felt too quiet to be real. You'd stand on the narrow balcony, one hand resting on the rusted railing, the other holding a cigarette, the last one you allowed yourself for the week. The sky above was colorless, more suggestion than hue, and the city stretched below like a map of secrets. You never smoked for the taste, you smoked for the pause. Each drag gave you a reason to stay out there a little longer, away from the ticking clock, the chipped floor tiles, the piles of unpaid things that weren't bills, but still felt like debts. In that tiny square of concrete hovering above the courtyard, you found something like solitude. Not freedom, not hope, just the soft permission to think. You blew smoke into the cold air and watched it disappear. Like everything else, the city was a machine, not in the way people imagine, loud, fast, mechanical, but in the way it absorbed your steps, your breath, your years. It swallowed names and dreams and small rebellions like a furnace fed by routine. You were 30, or maybe 35. You had stopped counting. Somewhere between paperwork and ration cards, you'd folded your dreams into smaller and smaller pieces. Now, they lived in the ashtray, in the soft music leaking from the neighbor's radio, in the books you never quite finished. You wanted something else. You didn't know what. Just, not this. Not more lines. Not more formality. Not the endless loop of winter and waiting and reports typed in triplicate. Not the polite conversations about state programs. Not the theater of participation. On that balcony, wrapped in your coat, watching the mist blur the windows across the courtyard, you asked yourself questions you never dared say aloud. What would it feel like to start over? What if you'd been born somewhere else? Somewhere warmer, freer, stranger? Would you have written poems? Would you have painted murals on train walls? Would you have loved differently? You took another drag. Let the ember crackle in the dark. Somewhere below, a cat knocked over a bottle. Somewhere above, a baby cried, and no one answered. And here you were, between stories, between decades, between the person you were told to be, and the one who only whispered inside. Sometimes you imagined leaving, not in a dramatic way, just quietly, buying a ticket on impulse, not telling anyone, getting off at a town you didn't know the name of, starting a small garden, selling bread from your window, laughing louder, loving harder. And yet, each morning you still rose. You still boiled the kettle. You still folded your coat over the same chair. You still did what was expected with a grace no one clapped for. But at night, when the city dimmed and the wind brushed the balcony like an old friend, you returned to your ritual. One cigarette, one look at the stars or the clouds pretending to be them, one moment where you didn't have to be useful. You only had to be you. And though no one saw it, though the system never marked it, though the world never paused to notice, that small act of being was revolutionary. Natasha stood in the middle of the schoolyard like a red flag on two tiny legs. Her scarf had been tied too tight by the teacher, a double knot right under her chin, turning her soft face into something ceremonial. She didn't mind. In fact, she stood straighter because of it, her arms stiff at her sides, her eyes wide, not from fear, but from something much more powerful, belief. It was the day she became a pioneer. The school, like most others, was a squat gray building with fading murals of smiling children and wheat fields. The paint had chipped years ago, but no one had ever touched it up. It was as if memory itself was being left to peel. But inside the gates, the world sparkled for Natasha, at least for now. Balloons in primary colors. An old speaker crackling out music that had played at every ceremony since her mother was a child. Rows of classmates lined up, faces scrubbed raw, shoes polished with cooking oil to fake a shine. Natasha clutched the edge of her white shirt, smoothing the wrinkles that refused to lie flat. She had practiced the salute in the mirror. She had practiced saying the oath without stumbling. And when her name was called, she stepped forward, heart thudding like a drum inside a wooden chest. Her shoes squeaked. The grass gave a little under her weight. And when the red scarf was tied around her neck, when the final tug cinched it close, she felt something lift inside her. Not pride, not yet. It was possibility. She looked over to where her mother stood, half hidden behind a fence post. They weren't supposed to wave, but they smiled at each other. The kind of smile that says, "I see you becoming someone I used to be." Later that evening, back home in the small apartment, Natasha sat by the window wearing the scarf like a crown. She refused to take it off, even for dinner, even when her little brother pulled at it and called it silly. "It means I'm part of something," she said, full of certainty. Her father chuckled softly from the kitchen. Not mocking, just distant. Her mother said nothing. She just folded a napkin 3 times and placed it under Natasha's soup bowl like it might protect her from what the world would one day ask. Outside, the lights of the courtyard flickered. Inside, the family ate in quiet reverence, not for the meal, but for the moment, for the tenderness of watching a child still unbroken by doubt, because Natasha believed. She believed in stars and songs, in unity and banners. She believed that if she stood straight enough, if she spoke clearly enough, if she kept her scarf spotless and her heart pure, she could help build something better, something brighter. And part of you envied her, not because you still believed, but because you remembered what it felt like to. That sense of direction, that clarity, before nuance, before weariness, before you learned that flags fade, songs get rewritten, and truth often comes wrapped in silence. In Natasha, you saw not only a child, but the next draft of the same story, the repetition dressed as renewal, the soft clay being shaped by familiar hands. And still, she was beautiful, in her stubborn joy, in her bright questions, in her refusal to see the cracks. That night, after she finally hung the scarf by her bed and fell asleep, you stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her breathe, wondering how long innocence could last, and whether it mattered, if it brought her comfort for now. Because sometimes, belief is a kind of armor, even if it's made of cotton and dyed red. The classroom always smelled of wet wool and chalk dust. On winter mornings, breath hung in the air like unfinished words. Children wore their coats indoors, not because they forgot, but because the radiator, tucked beneath the blackboard like a sleeping animal, rarely did more than hum. You remember your seat. Third row, near the cracked window that never quite closed. The wind would slide through the frame and snake across the floor, licking your ankles like a cold reminder. Don't move too much. Your shoes were second-hand, not from a sibling, from someone unknown. The soles had thinned, and the toe box was too wide. When you walked, they slapped the floor with a soft, pitiful sound. A sound that told the room you were coming, even when you didn't want to be seen. And yet, you sat. You wrote in the margins. You raised your hand when the teacher asked questions you already knew the answers to, because that was what a good child did. The teacher wore the same brown cardigan every day. Her voice had the texture of paper, dry, thin, easily torn. She never smiled. But you didn't mind. Smiles were rare currency, and you had learned not to crave them too much. What mattered was order, recitation, the ability to speak without blinking when asked, "What is the role of the young Soviet citizen?" You answered like everyone else, eyes forward, hands still, but your feet, they shifted. Inside those 2 large shoes, your toes curled, your heels lifted, your soul wandered. Sometimes you imagined they'd shrink overnight, that the shoes would suddenly hug your feet like they were made for you, that you would finally walk through the hall without that dragging sound, that you would run, not march, and someone would say, "Look, that one moves like she owns the ground." But the shoes never changed, and neither did the room. The lessons were always the same: loyalty, sacrifice, repetition. You learned poems about tractors. You sang songs about unity. You read stories where the child always reported the traitor, even if it was his father. You didn't question it, not really, but something felt off, not wrong, just loose, like the way your shoes didn't quite hold your feet, like the way the coat rack always had one peg too many, like the way the teacher looked past you when she spoke of bright futures. At recess, you watched snow fall through the wire mesh of the courtyard fence. The world beyond looked softer somehow, like it wasn't made of the same material. You pressed your forehead to the glass and left a fog print behind, just to prove you were there. A classmate once whispered that his father listened to forbidden music at night. You both laughed nervously, then swore to forget it. But you remembered, because even in that quiet laugh, you heard something not from the textbook, a possibility. Years later, you would forget most of what you memorized, but you would remember the cold, the chill of sitting still too long, the silence after a question no one dared to answer, the way your shoes, like the system, were always a little too big, demanding you grow into them, whether you could or not. You didn't hear it on the radio. Of course not. The radio played only what had been approved: choirs, marches, soft ballads about tractors and loyalty. You knew every sanctioned lyric by heart, and yet none of them ever settled in your chest. They passed through you like wind through an open corridor, chilling, forgettable. But one night, in the tiny kitchen of someone's Khrushchevka, a space barely big enough for 4 people to stand, someone brought out a small, battered turntable. The needle was crooked, the speaker buzzed, and then it started. A hiss, a crackle, and the opening chords of something that didn't belong. It was rock and roll. But not just any rock. It was smuggled, forbidden, born in another world and carried into yours on fragile, transparent slices of bone. You stared at the record. It wasn't vinyl. It was a rib cage. More precisely, it was a sheet of medical X-ray film cut into a crude circle with a cigarette lighter burned hole in the center. The image was still visible. Someone's spine, someone's lungs, their body, their absence, now carrying someone else's sound. They called it music on the bone. And it wasn't a metaphor. It felt like sin, which, of course, made it holy. The guitar was distorted, the drums too fast, the lyrics almost unintelligible. But what mattered wasn't clarity, it was the fact that it wasn't allowed, that someone, somewhere, had risked something to bring this sound here, that someone had believed you might need it. You sat there, cradling a chipped enamel mug of black tea, pretending not to cry. The others pretended too. They sipped and nodded as if this was casual, as if they weren't hearing freedom thrum beneath someone's ribs. The song ended. No one clapped. There was no need. Later, you walked home under a sky the color of tin. The wind was sharp, your coat too thin, but in your chest, something burned, not loudly, not enough to shout, but enough to dream. And that was the danger, wasn't it? Dreaming. Because dreams weren't just images that visited you in sleep. Dreams were dangerous when they persisted in daylight, when they clung to the corner of your mouth even as you recited your pledges, when they grew legs and rhythm and chords and asked you, "What if there is more?" You never found out who made the bone record, but you kept it, hidden in a shoebox beneath old linens, wrapped in a scarf you never wore. You'd take it out sometimes, not to play it, but just to look, to hold proof that silence was never complete, that someone had shouted, even if it was through the echo of someone else's lungs. And in your own silence you began to hum, not loudly, but steadily. They say the Soviet Union was built in the factories and preserved in the lecture halls. But that was never quite true. It was held together in the kitchens, not the public ones, not the old communal stoves lined with rusting pots and borrowed spoons, but the new kitchens, the private ones, carved out from Khrushchevkas like hidden chapels for the tired and the truth-starved. Your kitchen was barely wide enough to fit 4 chairs. The table was wobbly. One leg had to be propped up with a folded newspaper, but it was yours. And that meant it could hold secrets. On nights when the air outside stung with frost, you and your friends would gather here. The walls were thin, so you spoke quietly, but not too quietly, because sometimes the risk made the truth taste sweeter. The ritual was always the same. A bottle of cheap vodka, opened with ceremony, slices of black bread, slightly stale, pickles from someone's grandmother, fermented too long but perfect for biting through silence. And then it began. The real conversations. Not the slogans, not the public smiles, but the unsaid things finally given voice. Anna would start. She always did. She'd lean in, brushing her sleeve against yours, and say something like, "Do you ever feel like you're acting all the time?" You'd nod. Of course you did. You all did. Ivan, the most cautious among you, would pour slowly. 1 glass for each, no more. He believed in limits, even when the rest of you didn't. He'd say, "Today, at the factory, I watched a man pretend not to cry. Just stood there with oil on his hands, staring at nothing. No one would laugh. No one needed to, because everyone had seen something similar. In a hallway, a classroom, a metro car, where a man's silence shouted louder than any speech, and then someone would turn on the radio. Not for news, but for static. To mask the sound of honesty. That was the trick. Talk softly. Keep the radio on. Never say names. Never mention dates. Never tell the same story twice in public. But in that kitchen, with your feet warm under the table and steam curling from chipped teacups, you remembered what it was to be real. You didn't need to agree on everything. Politics, love, disappointment. It all came out. Sometimes someone cried. Sometimes someone stormed off. But the next week, they returned. Because the kitchen wasn't just for cooking. It was where truth lived when it had no other home. There was a kind of sacredness to the way the light fell across the enamel tiles, the way condensation gathered on the window, making every word feel like it might disappear the moment it touched the air. And yet, you spoke. You spoke because you were tired of being mute, because you needed to remember that you were more than a worker, more than a party member, more than a file in someone's drawer. You were a person, and in the kitchen you were allowed to be. No speeches, no permission, just the clink of glasses, the warmth of bodies leaning close, and the sound of someone whispering a dream they could never put on paper. You still remember the weight of it. A piece of paper, thin, worn at the edges. Your name scribbled in faded ink. A stamp, official and cold. And beneath it, the sacred promise. 1 loaf, 2 eggs, half a liter of oil. It was your ration coupon, your inheritance, your ticket to maybe getting through the week. And it was nothing. But back then, it was everything. You folded it carefully, tucked it inside your coat like a relic, and made your way to the store. If it could be called that. Really, it was more of a concrete cube with fogged-up windows and a line of human figures stretched like punctuation along the block. Some sat on crates, others leaned on walls. No one spoke. They all waited, just like you. The line, that silent monument to scarcity, moved slowly. Sometimes not at all. People brought books, knitting, flasks. One woman read aloud from a newspaper 3 days old, as if the words might warm the air. When someone left the line, no one asked why. They just closed the gap. Because here, in the Soviet marketplace, absence spoke volumes. You'd wait an hour to find nothing, 2 hours to find onions, 3 hours, a miracle, toilet paper. Once, after 4 hours, you stepped inside and saw shelves lined with cans. Your heart skipped, then sank. The cans were all the same: pickled herring, dented, dusty, expired, probably. But still, you took two, because two was the limit. At the counter, the woman in the uniform didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd seen thousands of you. You handed over your ration card. She stamped it with the weight of a system collapsing one tick at a time. And then, as you left, you heard someone laugh. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was hollow, almost cruel. The laugh of someone who'd waited for meat and gotten bones. Of someone who knew, really knew, that hope was not for sale. That night, you brought your herring home like a prize, opened one can. It smelled like metal and memories. You ate in silence, tried not to chew too loudly. Outside, the wind howled through the stairwell like it was mocking you. The light bulb in the hallway flickered, not out of drama, just age. No one would fix it. Not this week, not next. Your neighbor across the hall knocked on your door, asked for salt. You didn't have any. She smiled anyway, said, "It's fine." I knew you didn't. And that strange moment was what stayed with you. The smile of someone who asked for something, knowing they wouldn't get it, not because they were cruel, but because it was the only way to remember what it felt like to ask. You poured tea from leaves used twice, sat at your small table, steam curling upward in soft tendrils. And for a second, just one, you let yourself laugh too. Not because it was funny, but because if you didn't, you might not stop crying. It didn't start with an explosion. It never does. Change, real change, seeps in like fog under a closed door. You smell it before you see it. And even then, you pretend it isn't there. At first, it was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The radio, once so full of orchestrated certainty, heroic marches, factory announcements, and monotone voices reciting 5-year plans, began to hiss more than it spoke. You turned the dial slowly, eyes half shut, waiting for the familiar drone of progress. Instead, static, not loud, not violent, just empty. You let it play anyway. Better a wall of noise than a wall of truth. And then there were the glances. People stopped looking you in the eye, not out of rudeness, but out of mutual caution. In the hallway, your neighbor would greet you with a nod that never reached her mouth. At work, someone might say, "We do what we can," in a tone that almost meant something, and then go quiet. That was the most terrifying part. Not that people lied, but that they stopped saying anything at all. Even in the kitchens, those sacred spaces of whispered rebellion, the words came slower, the laughter thinner. You and your friends sat around the table, hands warming over tea that tasted like boiled hope, and no one mentioned what everyone was thinking. But it was there, in the way Pavel lit his cigarette and stared out the window a little too long, in the way Anna's voice cracked on the word future, in the way you pretended not to notice. The walls weren't bugged anymore. No one had the budget for that. But the fear remained, like furniture too heavy to move. One evening, you watched a news anchor pause mid-sentence, just for a second, like the words caught in his throat and he had to swallow them whole. Then he smiled, a little too wide, and kept going. You didn't smile back. You just turned the radio off. Later that night, you walked through the stairwell of your building. The concrete was crumbling at the corners, as if the walls were slowly exhaling after holding their breath for too long. You passed by the mailboxes, most of them rusted shut. Someone had written, "Truth is dead" in pencil above box 42. It was already fading. Maybe that was the point. At the market, prices kept rising, quietly. First rubles, then hours, then dignity. At work, the machines broke down more often. You fixed what you could and ignored what you couldn't. Everyone did. There was no grand announcement, no flag lowered, no anthem revised. Just a deepening silence like the hush before a funeral no one was invited to. But everyone attended anyway, and beneath it all, a question. How long has this been happening? You didn't have an answer, only a feeling, sharp and cold and impossible to name. You carried it like a second skin, like everyone else. At the center of the square, he had always stood tall, Lenin, stone-jawed, arm outstretched, pointing, always, toward a horizon no one could see anymore. Children once played beneath him, feet skipping over cracked concrete, too young to understand what his finger meant. Old men once saluted him on cold mornings, wool caps pressed against thinning hair, hearts heavy with something they no longer called belief, but still carried like a ghost in their coat pockets. He had seen weddings, parades, snowstorms that froze his collar white, and now he watched silence spread like rust. No one cleaned the base anymore. The paint around his boots flaked off in long curls. A pigeon nested in the crook of his elbow. One day, someone tied a scarf around his neck, red but faded, as if even the revolution had grown tired. You passed him every morning on the way to work. For years you barely looked, but then you began to notice. A crack along his coat, a slant to the pedestal, the weeds growing in the seams. It wasn't just the statue, it was everything. Cracks in the sidewalks, cracks in conversations, cracks in your memory. Like old film reels, skipping frames you wish you still had. They didn't teach you how to mourn an idea. No one did. So instead, you grieved in small, quiet ways. You stopped saluting. You stopped looking up. You stopped pretending that the pointing finger led anywhere at all. At night, your dreams changed. You no longer saw flags waving or tractors marching. You saw gray, endless corridors, and a statue face down in the snow. At work, your colleague whispered, "Did you hear?" In the other city, they pulled him down. You said nothing. But that night, you walked to the square. He was still there, still pointing. But the spotlight that once lit his face had burned out. No one replaced the bulb. And in that darkness, something inside you shifted, not shattered, not yet, but tilted, quietly, irrevocably. You remembered the day you learned his name as a child, how the teacher made you trace each Cyrillic letter like it was sacred. Now, you saw graffiti beneath his boots. It didn't say much, just a single word. Why? No one had answered. And you knew, even if someone did, it wouldn't matter. The answer had come long ago, in silence, with every loaf that didn't rise, every promise that didn't arrive, every young heart that dreamed in secret. The statue still stood. But in the hearts of many, it had already fallen. It didn't collapse in flames. There were no fireworks, no victory banners. Just winter. A long, cold, breathless winter. The kind where windows sweat on the inside and tea cools faster than you can drink it. The kind where even the clocks seem unsure whether to keep ticking. You remember standing in the kitchen. It was morning, or maybe evening. In those days, time was more suggestion than fact. The kettle rattled once, hissed, and fell silent. There was just enough gas left for one more pot of tea. You poured it slowly, like a ritual. 2 cups, one for you, one for the ghosts. Outside, snow drifted sideways across the courtyard. The old swing creaked in the wind, though no one had touched it in years. You sat at the table. The chair still wobbled. Some things outlived even empires. You wrapped your hands around the cup. No sugar, again, but warm. That mattered. On the table, the last newspaper lay folded. The headline didn't surprise you. Nothing surprised anyone anymore. SSSR прекращает существование. The letters didn't scream. They whispered. Like they too were exhausted. You read them again, slower this time, letting each syllable settle where memories lived. Your breath fogged the window. A child once drew stars there. Now only the outline remained. They didn't teach you what to do when a country ends. No ceremony, no closure, just the quiet ticking of lives continuing anyway. The woman upstairs still boiled potatoes. The man next door still cursed at the pipes. Children still ran down the stairs. Though their laughter sounded different now, like it belonged to a future still deciding what language to speak. In your chest, something ached. Not grief exactly, not relief either. Just wait. As if a great silence had moved in, unpacked its suitcase, and made itself at home. You didn't cry. You washed the cups, wiped the table, folded the paper and placed it inside a drawer, next to the old ration cards, a photo from 1974, and a rusted badge that once meant something. Later, you walked outside. The statue was gone. Just a square of lighter concrete where it had stood. No one spoke of it. The sky, however, was unusually clear, and for the first time in a long while you noticed how high it was. Maybe it had always been that high. Maybe you just hadn't looked up in years. You stood still for a moment. The wind passed through your coat like it always did. But this time, it didn't feel as cold. You exhaled slowly. And for the first time, there was no fog on your breath. Just air. Just you. And the quiet echo of something that had ended, but would never really leave, because the country may be gone, but you're still here. And everything it touched, the gray walls, the whispered truths, the shared bread, the stolen hopes, lives on in your hands, in your silence, in your tea. One last sip, warm. Then you washed the cup. And so we arrive back where every story ends, inside the quiet space of our own breath. You've just traveled a lifetime in slow motion, from a communal hallway thick with frost and borrowed mornings, through factory floors that taught hands to move before minds could wander, into cramped kitchens where truth simmered louder than any stove, past a square where statues cracked long before they fell, to a final cup of tea sipped while an empire silently folded itself away. What remains? Perhaps the simplest lesson of all. Systems crumble, symbols topple, but the small human rituals we share, the steam of tea, the hush of a balcony at midnight, the nervous laugh in a grocery line, outlive every headline. It is in those tiny, stubborn acts of ordinary care that people keep carrying light, even when the power flickers. If this journey offered you a moment of warmth, a spark of reflection, or just a gentler path to sleep, I'm grateful you stayed until the very last word. Your presence here is the quiet proof that stories still matter. If you'd like to help this little corner of calm keep growing, you can tap like, leave a thoughtful comment, or subscribe so you'll find your way back the next time we dim the lights and unroll another quiet tale. Each gesture, however small, tells the algorithm, and me, that gentle storytelling still has a place on this noisy internet. Until our next night together, take good care of your breath, your tea, and the soft spaces where your own stories live. Thank you for listening.